Okay, picking up from the Stanford-Binet, we're going to talk about some other commonly used intelligence tests, and we're still primarily on tests that are individually administered. So you need a trained facilitator who is familiar with the test with the purpose of allowing for different types of methodology to be used in measuring the various factors of intelligence, but also to hopefully reduce bias and to make sure that people are understanding the items as they were intended. Probably the most famous and most used is the Wechsler tests. David Wechsler wanted a test for adults, so he was wanting to create his own intelligence test. The Wechsler Bellevue 1939 was the first version of this, but then the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, currently in its fourth version, often referred to as the WAIS, WAIS 4, published in 2008, and it's normed for people that are ages 16 to 90. So remember we said that, young adulthood is when cognitive ability seems to be most predictive of lifetime ability. So this test is designed for adults and is not to be used for people under the age of 16. It's also a very good example of kind of best practices as David Wechsler brought in a lot of the current thinking and intelligence and has continued to revise his test based on the current theory. So it's a very solid hierarchical model. We have multiple levels. So there's 15 subfactors in the WAIS. There's verbal, perceptual reasoning, working memory, processing speed, but you also get a full score. So you're getting individual factors, but you're also getting that overall. So that's, again, a hierarchical model. One measure of intelligence, then subscales, and then even subscales of subscales. Generally speaking, it has been less bias versus ethnicity, gender, religion, and education than many other tests. It has been purposely designed and redesigned to try to be less culturally loaded, so a cultural fair, not culture free, but cultural fair test. So the Wechsler basically has its full scale IQ. The FSIQ is the top score, and that is your overall score. Again, normed off of the idea of kind of 100 being the average. Verbal IQ is a major subcategory, and performance IQ is a separate category. Now, under each of those, so under verbal, we also have the Verbal Comprehension Index and the Working Memory Index. And under performance, we have Perceptual Organizational Index and Processing Speed Index. And then further, another hierarchical level, under each of these are the subtests that are used to calculate this. So when you're taking a Wechsler test, you're going to take at the bottom, for example, there's going to be vocabulary items, similarity items, matching, information, and comprehension items. These will be both individual scores, but also summed into the Verbal Comprehension Index. Likewise, for the Working Memory Index, there's going to be questions addressing your arithmetic skills, your digit span memory, your letter number sequencing memory, and these again will be individual scores that will be summed into a Working Memory Index. Now, the Working Memory Index, that's second level, with Verbal Comprehension Index, also second level, are summed together to create your Verbal IQ, or VIQ. And the same process is happening on the other side of the right side of the chart with performance IQ. And finally, the average of verbal IQ and performance IQ is what gives you your full scale IQ. So the Wechsler is a very good example of a modern intelligence test that is taking into account this kind of hierarchical model of looking at individual facets of intelligence, but still coming up with an overall score. Wechsler also has the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for children. So with the success of the adult scale, he kind of went back to where it all started with the Stanford-Binet with a child scale published in 2003, and it's actually normed for ages 6 to 16. It's primarily a visual set, 11 subfactors, and in a lot of ways it's mainly just a childized adult scale. So, for example, the pattern recognitions became a little bit simpler and added color. So that's how they converted them. From the top, those black and white images are an example of the adult scale, and then the bottom images here are from the child scale. Similarly, if there were verbal questions, they were basically put into language or to be asked of children, because remember, this is an individually administered test, so it can also be an interviewer talking to a 6-year-old and asking them questions, showing them pictures, and asking them questions about them, to be able to measure intelligence with children. Wechsler also then created a preschool and primary scale of intelligence, the WPPSI-3, published in 2002. This one's actually normed for ages 3 to 7. So again, there's a little overlap with the previous scale, which is a norm for ages 6 to 16. And this is almost primarily a visual test, very simple problems, 12 subfactors, designed for children generally under 6. And one other thing about the Wechsler is most of these have been normed using various ethnicities and cultures, so you can actually get both national norms for these tests, but you can also get norms for particular groups of people, gender norms, ethnicity norms, cultural norms. Some other adult tests that are widely used today. The Woodcock-Johnson, currently in its 3rd edition, is normed for both children and adults. It's meant for basically ages 6 to 39. And it has 3 versions, and this is often used in organizations. So a lot of companies may use this for higher level selection for mid-level positions, mainly because you have some choices here on how long the test is. The extended version has 14 subfactors, standard has 7 subfactors, and there is a brief version with 3 subfactors. And that brief version also starts to do a little kind of gray zone where that can be administered online and is often the version used for selection. So the big difference between the Woodcock-Johnson and, for example, the Wechsler is that though they are meant at their highest level, so the Woodcock-Johnson extended, to be a very similar hierarchical model of intelligence, usually given individually, the Woodcock-Johnson also has some adaptability for other uses. There's the Kaufman Adolescent and Adult Intelligence Scale, the CAT, C-A-I-T, currently its 3rd edition. It's intended for ages 11 to 85, so each one of these scales also has a different group that it's been intended to be used with. And it's primarily based on figure drawings and interpretations of those drawings. It has 6 subscales, and it also has been designed to very strongly discriminate between 2 major subscales beyond those 6, and that's 3 fluid and 3 crystalline. So again, looking at that kind of genetic component versus that learned component. There's a fair amount of childhood tests, various tests used to kind of try to both identify gifted children, but also children needing additional assistance. The Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test in its 3rd edition is normed for children and adults, so it can be used with all groups, but it's basically made for 2+. All of the options are picture options as response choices. And again, this is an individually administered test most of the time. You'll usually have a test administrator to do this test. We have the Detroit Test of Learning Aptitude in its 4th edition, intended for ages 6 to 17 with 10 subtests. And this again, notice it's learning aptitude. So the picture vocabulary test is understanding images and being able to interpret what's going on in various pictures. That's the Peabody. The Detroit is mainly looking at learning aptitude. So it's trying to measure mainly fluid intelligence. So it's for kids and children 6 to 17, 10 subsets, but mainly trying to get at broadly how well are you adapted to learn new information. There's the Kaufman Assessment Battery for children, 2nd edition. It's intended for ages 2 to 12. It uses simulation tasks and a sequential task. So this is definitely an individually administered test. You need a test administrator, and you're not answering questions or choosing the right box or the right image that goes along in sequence. In this one, it's actually a series of sequential and simulation tasks, so manipulations and problem solving that people or children are given to determine their level of assessment. There's a Letter International Performance Scale revised, norm for ages 6 to 20, 6 subsets, and it's a little bit more similar to a lot of the other intelligence tests in that we have subtests, and it's made to measure both fluid and reasoning skills. There's also specific ability tests available. So the Differential Ability Scale, the DAS, is intended for ages 2 to 17 with learning disabilities and has 20 subscales. So this test is not necessarily made to discriminate between all levels of intellectual ability or cognitive ability across a large group of people. It's specifically for children that have already been identified as potentially having a learning disability, ages 2 to 17. It has 20 subscales, and the idea is to identify exactly where the disability is or the delayed development is. So it's an investigative scale. So, for example, if someone takes an overall G scale and gets a score 2 standard deviations or 1 standard deviation below the mean, that scale is saying you are below average, but it's not identifying where it is. So you can have someone that actually is very skillful in some areas, but actually very lagged in development in others. That's what the differential ability scale is for, is to identify where the problem is. There's the Vineland Adaptive Behavior Scales, the VABS, assesses social behavior and day-to-day function, usually based on observational reports from others. So basically, again, this is an individually administered test. It gathers information from the people dealing with the child. It's intended for children 3 to 18 and with adults with learning disabilities. But again, it's not necessarily looking at fluid or crystalline intelligence. This is looking more at kind of social and functional intelligence. So it's an assessment of where is the person in their ability to take care of themselves, to recognize safe and dangerous situations, to socially interact with people as necessary, and again, aimed at finding where the actual disability or developmental delays are to allow further interventions. There's also the Sequin Form Board. It's a nonverbal test including puzzles, block designs, mazes, and person drawings. So again, individually administered, lots of different tasks. And again, it's very nonverbal. So it can be used a little bit easily, more cross-culturally. And also, if the major deficit in someone with a learning disability is verbal communication, this allows an assessment of other cognitive abilities. So group testing is in contrast to most of what we talked about. A few of the intelligence tests that we talked about in the previous slides have a group version, but most of them are, again, intended for individual administration. Group tests gained popularity approximately in the 1920s, especially coming out of World War I. Arthur Otis developed the first group test for children based on Terman's Stanford-Binet scale. So again, the Stanford-Binet is an individually administered test. It is expected to be given by an actual test administrator. So Otis wanted to have a test that could be used for basically give to a bunch of kids at once and just score the test. And he came up with the Otis Group Intelligence Scale, later became the Otis-Lennon School Ability Test. And there's a lot of different tests out there today that kind of do this. Most of our kind of standardized testing, so whenever you're sitting down to take a standardized test, is some form of group intelligence test. Around the same time, Robert Yerkes developed tests for U.S. soldiers during World War I, the Alpha Army and Alpha Beta tests, also based on the Stanford-Binet, and somewhat on the Otis Group Intelligence test, so building on what was already there, looking at the literature and coming up with a new scale. But these were specifically designed. The Army Alpha was verbally based, so it was a typical pen and paper multiple choice type test to identify top, middle, and bottom performers as far as general cognitive ability. And the Army Beta test was actually a nonverbal version of this same test for people that had literacy issues. So today we have the Otis-Lennon School Ability Test, kindergartners up to 12th grade. There's cognitive ability tests for kindergartners up to 12th grade. Wonderlic actually has a personnel test used for employee screening. So all of these are basically versions of group tests. The idea is you don't need an administrator. You don't need to be doing one-on-one. It is a packet of questions that can be scored later and can be given to a large group of people. So the Wonderlic, for example, is a very good example of a test that doesn't have an individual version. It is only available as a multiple choice and generally online test that is primarily packaged to organizations to screen for cognitive ability. And as we talked about on Monday, cognitive ability is a very strong predictor of performance in organizations. So most of these group tests are more in the realm of kind of student achievement. So generally when we find group intelligence tests, we're looking at two different types. We're looking at tests that are specifically focused on measuring student achievement. So basically, how well is the student doing? And it often is normed. There's a raw score, often a norm score or percentile, and often a grade score. So for example, my son, who's currently 11, is often taking standardized testing, and currently he is is it 6th grade? I lose track sometimes. He's in the 6th grade. He is considered to have a 6th grade reading level, so he's average. He's considered to have a 5th grade writing level. He's not that great at writing, and he's a little behind. But he has an 8th grade mathematics level. So his mathematical ability is actually about 2 grades ahead of where he currently is. And in fact, I'm very proud of him. At the same time that he's in remedial writing, he's also in advanced math placement. Since he wants to be an engineer, this is probably not a bad thing. So those are student achievement tests. They're not necessarily being made to try to measure overall cognitive ability. They're not necessarily even claiming to capture fluid intelligence. They're mainly trying to capture how well is the student learning the material they're expected to learn at the level they're at. And then the other broad category of group intelligence tests are aptitude tests. And the aptitude tests are like the Wonderlic personality. They're more focused on fluid intelligence. They're meant to not necessarily capture what does the person know, but they're trying to get at how good that person will be at problem solving and learning new skills, because those are very highly predictive of doing well in a new job. So common characteristics of these kind of tests, they can be administered to large groups, so that's one of the things that makes them a group intelligence test. They're generally multiple choice questions or very cut and dry right or wrong fill in the blank questions, and generally they're designed to where they can be machine scored. So basically there doesn't have to be an administrator to score the test. It can be done automatically, often online. The content generally similar to individual tests, so they're often drawn from items or concepts that are being used in those individual tests, but then adapted for a mass testing situation. There often is a fixed time limit and a fixed number of items, and they're generally considered what is called a power test. That most of these, the fixed time limit has been adjusted to where most people should be able to answer most of the items in that period of time. The administration times vary, but generally are no less than 1 hour and often take up to 3 hours. There usually is a total score and some subscores, but generally these online or group administered tests have less subscores than those individual tests, often only 2 or 3. The research base here, however, is very large because once you create one of these tests, you start to gather an enormous amount of data on the reliability of the test as people take it over and over again in some situations. You have kids taking it in the first grade, second grade, third grade, fourth grade. So we can really start to look at how reliable these tests are and make adjustments. And as a result, these group tests are usually highly reliable. And we can also start looking a little bit better at validity. So we can start asking, not necessarily are we truly measuring a construct of intelligence, because as we said, we're not actually even completely sure theoretically what intelligence is, but we can really start looking at predictive validity. Do these tests actually predict performance, both in organizations and school? And the primary purpose is not categorization as much as it is prediction. Predicting how well a student's going to do, predicting if a student needs additional help, predicting if a student will do well in an advanced placement class, predicting if an employee will do well on the job.